The issue of chemicals in the environment is a story about science, politics, and humanity's relationship with the planet. My name is Chris Hughes, independent scientist, and this is the Chemical Journeys podcast. Join me as we uncover the story of chemicals in the environment through conversations with individuals working in this space. So, let's get started. Hello everyone, and welcome to the Chemical Journeys podcast. Today I'm speaking with Dr. Watze de Wolf of Reg MSc and formerly of the European Chemicals Agency. Watze, thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Chris, for having me.
I'm very, very happy to have you on. You're actually the closest that I've been able to come so far to having a regulator on the podcast, and I'm really excited to be able to speak with you and get your perspective. It's fair to say, though, that you're not just any regulator, that you've had a really long and illustrious career, starting out in industry where you've had senior roles at both Procter & Gamble and DuPont, and then you've worked for nearly 15 years at ECHA in various leadership roles, including the head of unit for REACH and also for biocides, and also as the chair of the member state committee. And then in amongst all of that, you've also had voluntary roles at CTAC, including as the world president and more recently as a member of the board of directors of CTAC Europe, and also a member of the board of trustees at the Health and Environmental Sciences Institute, or HESI. So it's fair to say it's quite an accomplished career, and I'm really honoured to welcome you to the podcast.
Thank you, Chris. It sounds like you've done your research. Yeah, it's been a career. It's been quite some time. And since 2 years, I'm formally retired. But that basically means I'm still quite happy doing the things I like to do on environmental science. That's the advantage of being a retiree. You can focus on the fun parts.
Yeah, it's nice to be able to pick and choose, I imagine. It was good to meet you also in Vienna this year at the CTAC Europe conference. So perhaps we can start this conversation by hearing it from your perspective. So I've given a little potted sort of CV for you there, but perhaps you could talk a little bit about your background, your career journey, and your motivations in your own words.
Yeah, well, thanks. And let me start with my educational background. I think that's quite critical for what I have done in the rest of my career also. I'm by training a biologist, but then in my master's, I worked on QSARs. So I'm very strong in animal-free ecotoxicology. And in that period, we were using basically KOW, octanol water partition coefficient, as a descriptor, as a proxy for biological systems. And the fun part was for me that I was basically in a group with only chemists, organic chemists, and I was the only biologist. So I learned from them a lot of chemistry, and I hope I taught them a little bit of biology. So on that interface between two different areas is where I've been working quite a lot. My supervisor was Joop Hermans. He received one of the educational awards from CTAC, and he considered himself a clock maker. So he really wanted to understand how things worked. So he could make things. Not necessarily a vision of designing a clock, but really going in deep, understanding all the different cogs and stuff. And I have a little bit the same thing. I want to understand. So for me, when you're working in QSARs, you can do it with statistical approaches such as neural networks, which are mechanistically speaking black boxes. And I would say currently you would describe these things as AI systems, to be fancy. We were focusing more on trying to have mechanism-driven QSARs instead of statistical ones. Understanding the mechanism is important. And one of the things I learned also in that time was that with QSARs, there's uncertainty in the application of QSARs. And when you are working in business, in the development of new chemistry, you can deal with that uncertainty because you have, let's say, 10 chemicals and you jot it down to a couple of lead ones. So it's okay to miss maybe a chemical. When you go to regulatory action, you also can use QSARs But there it becomes much more black and white if you go into restriction of a chemical on the basis of a QSAR. So uncertainty in the use can be quite different from a business point of view or a regulatory point of view. So uncertainty is a big thing, I think, in QSARs. And as I mentioned, working with organic chemists and analytical chemists, it continued in my PhD. I worked in the same group of Joop, and then started to do basically more bioconcentration work and understanding biotransformation as an impact on reducing the bioconcentration potential. There, I started to learn how to deal with basically GC, gas chromatography, HPLC. And that was the PhD thesis was quite a nice start for also then doing some postdoc work. I moved to the US for that. I went to a lab which was basically the research lab, the toxicology lab for DuPont in Delaware, where I started again on an interface between different fields. I worked on acute inhalation toxicity in rats. So, acute toxicity through inhalation is basically the same as fish toxicity. Lungs or gills are sort of the same. So, in the US, you had in those days a company called Toys R Us. And you also have a certain strain of rats called Fisher rats. So we had as a big thing in our lab the fish, R rats, which is the logo of the Toys R Us. And when you go to acute inhalation, very easily you can use again Henry's law constant as a partition coefficient between air and water, and also KRW, and that you can do a QSAR for acute inhalation, with the exception for reactive chemicals. Same applies in ecotox. And also the combination of ecotoxicity with bioconcentration, moving into the concept of internal lethal concentration, initially pointed or poised by Lynn McCarthy, was a thing that we were combining. So we were looking in that postdoc also into what are the internal concentrations in the rat. And I learned there about the TTC concept, the threshold of toxicological concern. And in my further time, that led to development also of what I would call the ETNC concept, the environmental threshold of no concern. Nowadays, people call it the environmental threshold of concern, but this is communication. It's, for me, no concern. It's if you're below that level, there is no concern. If you're above the level, there is a concern. And this is the strange thing in toxicology. A positive result is actually a negative thing. If you have toxicity, it's called a positive outcome. Well, is it positive if it is toxic?
And it's very difficult to prove the negative, let's say, or prove the positive in that case.
Yeah, exactly. But if you have a whole lot of data and analyze that, you can come to a sort of level, the minimus level, below which you do not see any toxicity. And then also depending maybe on the chemistry class. So this TTC concept or the ETC concept is important if you lack data on the specific chemical. From my postdoc, I went to what I would call the Procter & Gamble University. So I started working within industry, and Procter & Gamble has a lot of environmental scientists working across the globe on ecotoxicology, where you had Scott Ballinger working on experimental streams, environmental fate and behavior. You had a biodegradation guru there called Tom Federley, and I would say a risk assessment bright star, Tom Feitel. I worked with all of those people, and they taught me so many things. Yearly gathering of all these environmental scientists from the globe, and we were with 80 to 100 individuals. It was just a great time to further develop my knowledge and know-how. Procter & Gamble allowed me to work in ECHA task forces, where we, among others, worked on the TRA model that later got incorporated into REACH exposure assessments. I also became the environmental classification and labeling expert for industry, because classification and labeling was very important for a consumer products company. You don't want to have a dead fish, dead tree on your consumer product. So that led me to be the CEFIC expert in the context of the OECD GHS development. And there I learned that expert committees doesn't mean environmental experts. So we were in the environmental expert committee, and we were talking about the bioconcentration factor cutoff for the GHS labeling. And I started discussing bioconcentration kinetics, uptake and elimination kinetics, and with the exception of a few people, like Steve Robertson and Hendrik Thule, I saw the shutters go down on the majority of the members of the expert committee. So there I learned, they were experts in policy setting and in politics, but not necessarily in environmental science.
Mm-hmm. Maybe I can just acknowledge that as well. It's important to recognise that we are working in a limited pool of expertise here in quite a complex technical area. I think it's important to recognise that, because a lot of people are interested in this area, but understanding can take quite some time to establish at a deep level.
Yeah, exactly. And I think we need to understand that if we work so long in the field, I had at a certain moment a chat with somebody from the European Parliament, and I was explaining the difference between two chemicals. One was a salt and the other was not a salt, was the acid. And I got the question, what is a salt? So that realized to me that, okay, I need to go to Chemistry 101 in order to make my message. So you always learn to know your audience when you give a presentation, find out what they know and provide that tailored communication to what they know. So you as a scientist will have to adapt to the people you talk with. That's not easy. We're not taught to do that. And it's something that throughout my career, communication has been important. And I think CTEC can also be a very nice platform to have more discussions between scientists and social scientists or communication experts on how we can better communicate our science. And I think it is critical these days with all the early communications on TikToks and other areas,
Yes.
that we as a scientist get tooled to be able to communicate there, so that the general public understands and appreciates our messages.
Yes, it's always been a challenge, hasn't it? It's always been a slow and laborious process to actually work through this discourse and address understanding and whatnot. If anything, it's gotten more difficult these days because of the general reduction in attention span that we all have.
Yeah. And I must say, as a scientist, I worked a lot with the communicators in ECHA when we were bringing messages out. I always was cringing because I mentioned earlier uncertainty, and that is, I think, one of the things I cannot necessarily do black and white, because there is not necessarily black and white. But my colleagues from the communication department didn't want that uncertainty,
Yes.
because then the message gets diluted for them. So that was always this finding that balance. And okay, for the podcast today, I've decided maybe to be less dealing with uncertainty, maybe a bit more black and white, Chris. So we'll
That's
see
fine.
what
Whichever way you want to take it.
out there. Yeah, because it's about what are the messages you want to get across. For me, I learned through my career, I've been a scientist, but I've also been in a technical management role. I was at a certain moment in time head of unit of a regulatory group in P&G. That basically, I started to learn, nah, that's not totally for me. Then I went back into the science and started to work with DuPont. There became basically over time a senior manager for health as well as environmental sciences. They wanted me to come to the US to manage some groups there. I said, no, I don't want to go to the US. And nowadays I'm very happy I'm not there. And then I went to Finland and started to work with the European Chemicals Agency. But yeah, before I go into that, maybe I can point to a message about the difference between consumer products industry and industrial chemicals industries. DuPont is more industrial chemicals, Procter & Gamble consumer products. And as I mentioned, I was the CEFIC classification and labeling expert when I was at P&G. The moment I started in DuPont, I left that field for the reason that for DuPont it was much less important. Yes, if a chemical gets labeled for environmental reasons, when you have a production plant of 50 million euros, you put in place measures to manage the releases into the environment. So you do risk management in the sense of putting in place processes that make sure you don't get releases. Consumer products industry, that is not necessarily possible. So the risk management strategy there is to move away from a chemical when you have a classification and you find other products easily. Well, for chemicals industry or for industrial chemicals, you have 50 million invested in your plant that can produce maybe one chemical. So you're not moving away that fast, and you're probably more interested in also doing a lot of advocacy work on that chemical that is of critical importance for your final daily bread.
Mhm.
And
Yeah, maybe I can reflect a bit on that point because you were clearly classification, environmental classification was a key driver when you were at Procter and Gamble, and less so when you were at DuPont. And I suppose that when I look at the recent developments with the CLP regulation, for instance, where the new hazard classes like PBTs and PMTs and VPVMs and VPVBs have been introduced, to me signals a shift in the potency or the severity of environmental hazard classification under that regulation. The previous classifications weren't they weren't, let's say, nice, but the assumption around PBTs, for instance, is that there is no real safe threshold to emit those to the environment. But I'm sure you'll come on to a bit more about
yeah,
that.
we definitely can talk more about that. Also, given that in the discussions about the PMT criteria or the concept even of PMT, those discussions took very much place in the member states committee of ECHA.
Mm,
And I was chairing that member state committee when we had those discussions. And can give some insights in that although I wasn't involved in the PBT, in the original development of those criteria, in the context of GHS, yes, but that was a
yes.
translation of the EU system into a more global system.
Hmm.
But with the B there, the bioconcentration, you at least had, let's say, somewhat more a biological element in the criteria.
Hmm. Hmm.
When you talk about PMT, there is no biology there. It's purely the environmental fate and behavior aspect.
Mm.
And the protection target for PMT or VPVM chemicals is a little bit, let's say, unclear in the regulations. In the discussions,
Mm.
it became very clear that basically our protection target is humans.
Yeah.
The concern is driven by these materials moving through the environment, not being able to be removed in a drinking water preparation, and therefore leading to contamination of drinking water, and therefore leading to human health issues, possibly. But the environmental factor there is so the biological element is not there. For if a PMT is released into the environment, then what is the concentrations that you can get in an ecosystem? What's the build-up through biomagnification? It's not there anymore. So
Hmm.
with the PMT concept, we're, I think, have lost the biology. And with the P concept that we are now moving into, only looking at P, I think we're even losing overall the link to human health. Persistence in itself, for me, is not a hazard. It's not a risk. And we have been moving with the classification and labeling from a little bit of risk with PBT, VP, VB to a situation where we are just looking at a property only, which I think for me as a risk assessor is really difficult to accept. I do acknowledge that for policymakers, there is this need for maybe easier tools than the complex risk assessment. But I see it as a simplification of the world. And yeah, I'm living in a complex world and I prefer to continue living in a complex world.
Yeah, I think that's. I mean, I'm sorry. I think I've completely derailed our discussion now, but perhaps we can linger on this before you carry on with your discussion on your career experience. I've been working on persistence, and the topic has kind of fascinated me. I feel like I've been kind of watching it all unfold over the last sort of 10 years, a complete paradigm shift in our approach to handling chemicals and accepting chemicals in our society. And I do think that part of this relates to, and I think the PMT concept captures it well, is that we no longer consider risk with chemicals. We just don't want them getting out into the environment, or we don't want them getting towards people, perhaps via drinking water, such that it has always been the case that people can be exposed to chemicals via the environment, but it was always something that was understood and accepted by risk assessors as a necessary trade-off of our human development. Whereas now it's kind of caught up with everybody who at least had expertise in this area that this wasn't well understood societally, and it's very difficult for people to accept, and it's a source of kind of runaway policy developments, which is kind of catching us all, threatening to wash us all away, let's say.
It's an evolution. When I look over the 30 years, in the beginning, and this is again a black and white statement, but you could say, well, shoot the environment or shoot the analytical chemist. Why would you want to shoot the analytical chemist? Well, they can detect anything. A few molecules can be detected. And when you detect and then publish that I found this substance here and there, you got a lot of non-acceptance in society. It wasn't put into context. It wasn't put into context of risk assessment. So what did you find it? And that so what question is very, very critical. And I think we have moved not only away from, yeah, I can find it and therefore it's a problem, into with the persistence discussion, it's more like you could find it and therefore it's a problem. And yeah, as I said, I'm more of a risk assessor. I prefer to put it then into the context of, okay, what are the different concentrations that you find? What are the tox information that we have? What are the over time increases in the concentrations you find? When do we get to this level that possibly poses a risk?
Mm-hmm,
And
mm-hmm,
yeah, we're not good in communicating that also because okay, Anglo-Saxon language has this difference between risk and hazard, but many languages do not distinct between risk and hazard. And
mm-hmm.
if you just raise a hazard, then people are immediately like, okay, no, no, not for me. No, no chemicals for me. And yeah, we will have to live with chemicals. Some of the
Yes.
most toxic ones are natural. So
Indeed, yes, yeah, yeah. I almost see it as a kind of, I can take it almost further, I think, in that, well, first of all, for persistence, we've had this concept of persistence, but as you sort of mentioned earlier, this was always part of the PBT assessment. And as a result of that, we had criteria where we would say that beyond this, above this level of slowness to degrade in the environment, you would be considered persistent, because if combined with bioaccumulation, then there was this multiplication of the exposure and, the concern of magnification up the food chain, such that was the basis for establishing those criteria. But we now have, and I think this was actually a blind spot in all of this, was these issues of effectively non-degradable chemicals like PFAS, which the argument has been made that, well, if we emit these, they're going to build up in the environment because they don't degrade, and that's not acceptable. That's not, sustainable, that we're polluting the environment with non-degradable chemicals. And I feel that was another blind spot for risk assessors, because we tend to, in risk assessment, always assume a steady state concentration, or that there'll be a maximum concentration at a point source and the rest of it will get diluted away and eventually degraded. Well, if the chemicals don't degrade, I think that challenges the paradigm. And ultimately, the way I see persistence now is that it has become the ultimate inversion of our risk assessment paradigm, in that early on, 10 years ago even, you couldn't really get people to talk about persistence. It just wasn't that interesting to them. It was one component of a very complex risk assessment process. Well, now it's become the top of the triangle, and I see that almost universally across industry, this sort of bewilderment that this has happened, kind of just almost overnight.
Yeah, it's not necessarily overnight, but it is hitting now rather directly. I mean, we've had discussions about very persistent substances like dioxins, like PCBs, but some of them had very bioaccumulative properties. We've now moved indeed to persistence as a thing by itself. We forget about the biology, but we also forget about the whole concept of non-extractable residues. There are substances that do bind to materials in the environment and bind such that they cannot be extracted anymore. So how does that mitigate potential persistence is another blind spot, Chris, that I'm not seeing much work on that going on.
Yes.
And
Well, I mean, yeah, again, it was another thing that the regulation found impossible to deal with, that uncertainty, to the point where they had to assume that it was all the original chemical and that one day it might come out and get you.
yeah, well, and this on the persistent side and specifically the PFAS discussion, it was interesting. I recently read an article which defined the PFAS as substances that cannot be degraded. But later in the article, there was then the concern raised that these PFAS materials would have an ultimate degradation product, trifluoroacetic acid. And yeah, that was a little bit inconsistent. It cannot be degraded, but you have an ultimate degradation product. So the PFAS discussion is a bit mixed in the sense that, is it now fully persistent, forever chemical? Or are we talking about TFA as an ultimate degradation product? And if we're talking about TFA as an ultimate degradation product, again, it becomes complex in the sense that for every PFAS, you would need to get a little bit more information on how fast does it degrade to this TFA. But for TFA, you would need to generate information on how fast does it increase in the environment and what are the toxicity profiles. And when you look at TFA from an environmental point of view, it has a relatively low toxicity. Maybe on the human health side, the toxicity concerns are bigger, but then we're getting into a discussion again about drinking water problems potentially in the future with TFA. So we're just by saying it's persistent and on that basis do regulation, I'm not very happy. Regulating it on the basis of it could give rise to TFA. Well, tell me, give me a risk assessment for TFA. Give me timelines for at what moment in time do you expect TFA to rise to levels that become, from a risk assessment point of view, unacceptable. not from a societal point of view, but from a risk assessment point of view. I must say I haven't seen those yet.
Yes. Well, I've seen one paper, I think, that looked at the kind of very, very long term projections, recognizing that in the end, a lot of these chemicals that do flow in water, they have typically an end destination, which is the ocean and the deep ocean eventually, and calculating what concentrations might ultimately be reached in the deep ocean by the end of the century, let's say. But again, a lot of it is about the timescale that we're working to and the setting, and there's always a nuanced picture there. And the danger is when we rush to simplify that situation. I've certainly noticed that when I've been working on persistence over these last years, that a lot of our assumptions are to simplify the environment, using models. We simplify the environment to 3 boxes or 4 boxes, a water box, a sediment box, a soil box, and an air box. And when you actually go out and try and, the danger is that you incorporate that into your conception of the real environment, and then you start to overlook a lot of things. And
Um,
I'm conscious that I've completely derailed our discussion, so feel free at any time to
well,
go
no,
back
no,
to.
I like this. Yeah, we're simplifying seriously. Also on the dock side, we have our algae, Daphnia, and fish, and that's the world. But whatever lives in that deep ocean, what are the sensitivities of those species for chemistry? Is it comparable to our 3 model species? It's a totally different environment, also biologically. We don't know much about. On the one hand, if we do the risk assessment on the basis of our model species and our model compartments, how well does that reflect the actual environment? There's always the issue that is difficult to address, and it's easier to say than since we don't know, we need now to take regulatory action because the uncertainty is too high. And yeah, maybe I'm too much optimistic there. I think the uncertainty is not necessarily too high there. But going back to my background a little bit
Please.
and pitching that on the persistent still, you started the persistent interest group within CTEC. And thanks for that. I think it's very important that you did that. And CTEC is actually a great place for doing these type of things, for having these discussions that you and I are having. CTEC has been part of my scientific career all over. It's been very important, and I would advise any aspiring scientist in the environmental field to go to CTEC meetings. Disclaimer, I have here a conflict of interest because I'm in the board of directors of CTEC. But really, it is the place where you meet people, where you can build your networks, where you can launch some ideas that can either be picked up or shut down. No problem if they are shut down. This is part of the scientific process.
Yes.
I got already at my PhD time the opportunity to start being engaged in also the CTEC governance. And that continued when I was working in DuPont. So basically, I started with CTEC in the previous century. And in early years of this century, CTEC didn't have an executive director anymore. And the CTEC board or executive committee came to me since I was working around the corner of the offices to become interim executive director for a year. And my then boss at DuPont was also a scientist, and he saw the advantages of it in the sense of also reputation for DuPont, of course, but also for me building further my network with environmental scientists across Europe and across the globe. So he allowed me to do that for 1 day a week. It led to me, after a year, picking up becoming the treasurer. I then got into the CTEC World Council. That in those days was CTEC World was in the initiating stages. And in 2006, I became world president. There, I took the initiative to get CTEC recognized as an environmental NGO at UN level. And yeah, very, very satisfying times. In 2010, I then moved to ECHA, and there was less opportunity for me to go to CTEC meetings. mainly because I became again a manager and not necessarily an environmental scientist. And I also believe that it was important for the young scientists in ECHA to go to CTEC. So I stepped away for some years, and since my retirement, I feel like, okay, I still have something to contribute to the governance of CTEC. So I again let myself be elected. I put up myself up for election and been on the CTEC board of directors since May this year. But in my ECHA times, more on the background, pushing CTEC within the organization. I think it's critical for the scientists in ECHA to be exposed, if I can say so, to
Hmm.
academics, to industry, outside of a context of REACH or the Biocidal Products Directive or any of the other chemicals legislations that they work on or are going to work on. I can only advise that to young scientists. You will find there still people that do risk assessment. So it's a good way of expanding your know-how and knowledge.
Yeah, they do still exist. That's for sure. Yeah, I can totally attest to CTAC being a real life-changing organization and providing so much opportunity for so much insight and learning and development within that precious week each year at CTAC Europe. I've been to every conference since 2013, apart from one which coincided with the arrival of my son. So yeah, I can totally attest to how great CTAC has been.
Yes. Yeah, it's I mean, I've also been quite active in the context of ECHA, which is an industry scientific organization, and Cefic LRI, which then well works with externals on scientific projects. But it's different from going from that bubble of industrial scientist into a CTEC meeting where you get other views. And the same for ECHA scientists, you're in a bubble of regulatory science, and then being exposed
Yes.
to a broader world is critical. And I think for me personally, it has been my scientific home. I early on took a career into industry and the regulatory field. I probably should have gone for a career into academia because I'm much more interested in that than in managing. I can do managing,
Mm.
but after a while it starts to itch and I need to leave for something new. So, and in ECHA, I actually did that. I initially started as head of unit in evaluation. So looking at
Mm.
dossiers that the industry had brought in and reviewing that with the team. And my main motivation for doing that was, okay, in DuPont, I have been preparing dossiers and preparing strategies. And then I was thinking, well, they wanted me to go to the US. I didn't want to go there. So then there was this opening in ECHA, and I was like, okay, if I go there, I can learn how others look at this legislation and go again outside of my own bubble into broadening my views and experience. It was a very nice experience. I learned there that I have been very blessed by working for companies that did have a strong scientific interest and risk assessment interest, and also doing the right thing on the regulatory point of view. I must say that looking at some of the dossiers that were submitted to ECHA and also having had discussions with some of the companies that submitted those dossiers, I can understand why regulators are skeptical about industry. There are white ravens, but there are also industries that do not deliver on what they are preaching. And yeah, that gives skepticism. I think that's rightly so. If you do not see somebody delivering on what they said they were going to do, then why would you give them a chance? So there, this skepticism with the regulators, I think also then trickles through to the policymakers within the ministries, policymakers at the EU level. And yeah, you become a little bit more concerned maybe about what some industries are doing. As I said, not all, I would say, ones involved within ECHA or CEFIC LRI are much more proactive than many of the others. And I've had the privilege of working with those sort of companies.
You come at this from quite a unique perspective in that you have experience from both the sides, and I would say that, as you've alluded, you had the best opportunities to work with the organizations that were really doing important work on developing the methodologies and doing the science within industry. But that was not a universal situation in every company by any stretch. And I also wonder whether over time that quality or the amount of work that's going on within companies has reduced sort of in line with the development of the regulations within Europe and also the taking on of additional responsibilities at ECHA and the additional obligations on industry to kind of feed this regulatory system that we've built.
Yeah. It is very much a paper system in the sense that industry submits dossiers to ECHA. ECHA scientists look at it and they need to decide if it's compliant or not, and then come to a decision together with the member states about whether or not further information need to be generated. And there is limited human interaction. I find it a pity. I must say that it's difficult to write something up that is unequivocally understood by everybody. So when you write things up, there's always some unclarity. And in an environment of skepticism, you would then assume for the worst, and you would basically assume that the one who submitted the dossier didn't do their job. I've had personally done also some dossier evaluations, and I came across one dossier where it was unclear what they actually were meaning. I happen to know the name on that dossier, the individual. I knew through my STOC Cefic LRI activities, so I decided just to give the person a call and say, hey, listen, I have no idea what you mean. And then we talked, and oh, is that what you did? Why don't you write that up? Because that I can accept. So, okay, then gave them some time to update and then looked at the dossier. Yes, now we understood. Now we could say, yes, this is fine. And there was no need for going into a very tedious decision-making process. Why was I able to do it? Because I have my network. I'm relatively confident in my science. I'm willing to talk to people. That's why I could do this. But I would say the poor young scientists that have to go through this, that don't necessarily have these contacts, they may feel rather threatened by picking up the phone. And they may feel that it's easier to go through this tedious process of writing a decision all through paperwork and only
Yes,
communicating through paper. So it's important that the scientists in ECHA have the opportunity to build some confidence. Also, because
yes,
in this tedious process, they will have to defend their outcome of their process towards scientists of the member states. They need to do that in the member states committee.
mm.
And yeah, you know how two scientists, three opinions. So if you are a young scientist, you go to the member states committee and you get a load of opinions and you need to defend yours. That's daunting. That's very daunting. So it's not an easy job for those scientists, and building the confidence is very important. And CTEC can help there.
Yes.
Yeah, sometimes it basically means there is no communication, and therefore there is also decisions that are rather strict.
And perhaps, yeah, we can linger on this for a bit because it is very important, I think, to capture that perspective of the typical eco scientist kind of trying to deal with this, but also how that translates into a system that we're all working in with the regulation. I mean, we spoke earlier about there's been a tendency to simplify things, but on the other hand, there is also huge complexity to the regulatory system, and hundreds of pages of guidance, and as you said, almost automated in a way that we've built these rules and the risk assessment structures such that we've kind of outsourced our expert discretion to a large degree to many decisions in order to have a one size fits all regulation. I can attest that also translates to the other side as well when industry's trying to make sense of regulation and to build the case around a substance, that they have to try and digest that regulatory complexity and interpret it, and maybe it doesn't fit perfectly to their particular situation, and they don't have an opportunity to speak with anybody about the specifics of that. And so that creates a lot of anxiety, I think, in terms of they're investing huge time and effort with not a lot of confidence that things will work in the end, and it might still be for naught. And I suppose, read across is one example, right, where there is this ambiguity that has to be grappled with, and this uncertainty. It's been that friction, hasn't there, between regulators and industry about when read across should be used and the added costs of having to do additional testing when it gets rejected.
Well, I can only advise industries that want to make sense of REACH to also follow the discussions in the Member States Committee, because there is where the Member States, together with ECHA, try to make sense of the regulation. That's where we sort of developed further rules on how to interpret the law. The Member States Committee very much said, let's say I mentioned it earlier, the whole discussion about the PMT concept was taking place in the context of Member State Committee discussions. The whole discussion about simulation testing and setting the temperature requirements of 12 degrees or 20 degrees, the discussions there took place in the Member States Committee. So for the technical developments, the Member States Committee has played a very important role, both in the evaluation decision, substance evaluation, but also in the substance of very high concern and developments. And well, we were talking about the confidence and developing the confidence with the scientists, the young scientists. I cannot refrain but telling you a nice anecdote about overconfidence. We had a discussion about a certain dossier evaluation decision, and there's always then the possibility for the industry, for an industry expert to join in the discussion. It's very valuable for the Member States Committee to have that communication, have that discussion with them. But here we had a very interesting toxicologist who was a little bit overconfident. I cannot refrain but saying that individual came from the US and lectured the Member States Committee as follows. She said, "You do not know how to interpret REACH. It has to be read like this." Now, that was for the gremium, the Member States Committee that had to interpret REACH, rather offensive. So after that intervention, that overconfidence, there was limited, how shall I say, interest to come to a decision that was more favorable for the company. They were rather strict in their interpretation after that. This skepticism for industry, how will it be taken up? The only way is to engage with the scientists at ECHA. Well, definitely through written communication in the beginning, but any opportunity that you have to meet them in person is, I think, an opportunity you have to take, either at CTEC or at the ECHA events. And it's also good for the scientists at CTEC or at ECHA to see some perspectives from an industrial point of view. Because let's be honest, if you have not worked in industry, it may be a little bit of a strange beast. And you may also live a little bit like academics sometimes in an ivory tower if you only confine yourself to the Helsinki environment.
Mm-hmm.
But that is very much, let's say, focusing on the evaluation side. You have other
Mm.
elements in ECHA, authorization and restriction groups that work on there. They are much more involved, I think, with the discussions with industry, know more about industrial processes. And then, of course, you have the people working in the biocidal area, small group, and I've had the opportunity to work there as a head of unit for biocidal products for the last 2 years that I was in ECHA. And I must say, as a risk assessor, that is much more hawk's heaven. There are a lot of risk assessment possibilities, many different uses, many different exposure scenarios. It was very nice. And I must say, there's a slightly different perspective than in the REACH side, in that there is more communication between the industry and the member states, but also there is, I think, more willingness to listen to the arguments of the industry as compared to the REACH side. And yeah, the difficulty for industry there, I think, and not only for industry, it's also for the regulatory authorities. The BPR is super complex, and it is having an issue with moving goalposts. Dossiers take a lot of time. And during the dossier review, you may get a new guidance. And what happens is then there's a tendency to really do the whole assessment on the basis of the new guidance. That makes it long, unpredictable for industry. It creates a lot of workload for them, but also for the regulators. It's basically that the whole system is clogged up. There's different bottlenecks, both on the active substances as well as on the products.
Is that a testament to too much science? Perhaps it's trying to accommodate that nuance.
I wouldn't say that because I'm biased. I like science.
Yeah, it's never too
But
much.
it is, I think the processes are just too complex. And one of the things that if you have an update of guidance, don't restart at that moment. Continue with the dossier on the basis of the original guidance. And if you see a potential concern after a quick screening assessment on the basis of the new guidance, then you could always say, okay, now we can approve this substance for now, but we start an expedited review process. Then you can focus on the new elements and keep and the old elements are basically covered. And if the new elements do not raise on the toxicity side that you would see lower toxicity than the toxicity thresholds that you have used in the original assessment, then you're done. But yeah, we have introduced endocrine disruption as an endpoint in the BPR. And basically everything now needs to be assessed with that endpoint. But in the context of lack of data, industry then gets a possibility to generate the data. On the basis of the REACH context, there was this idea of tiered data generation, which from an animal welfare point of view may be the right thing to do, with every time in the interim steps to assess, do we go to the next step, more and more animal use? But that has led, I think, to a lot of delays in the approvals. It has led maybe also to, at this moment in time, no slots in contract labs for doing testing, even more delays. And in the meantime, you keep a substance on the market that for other endpoints, you might already say, hey, we need to ban this stuff. We need to get it off the market. And that is where I have a concern that it doesn't, the ED endpoint leads to lots of delays, but we could have substances that we should basically remove on the basis of other endpoints. But we're not doing it because we're waiting for the ED assessment. There is a review of the BPR at the moment going on, which is a good thing. And maybe in the future, there will be a possibility to do it slightly different here. But the BPR is interesting because the classification and labeling authorities have always shied away from going through a classification and labeling harmonization for ethanol.
Yeah.
And that's purely a political decision because from a toxicologist point of view, we know ethanol is a reproductive toxicant, category 1B for sure, maybe 1A. Nobody wanted to burn their fingers on that because ethanol is rather widely used across our society. And once you have been classified as a Repro 1B, you cannot use it in consumer products.
Mm.
Now, in the context of the biocides, ethanol is also a biocidal product or biocidal active. So now there is this assessment going on for ethanol. And in that assessment, there will have to be a determination, although it is not a harmonized classification, but the authorities will have to come to a conclusion on, is this now a reproductive toxicant or not? And if it is, then many uses will have to be banned. And disinfection uses in hospitals, for instance. So now I'm going a little bit back to my original adversity against classification and labeling. We will get a call from many people that say, yeah, but my use is so essential that we cannot ban this. We still need to allow this in product A, B, or C. And instead of using risk assessment as a tool for policymakers for making a judgment, is it safe or not, we will now have to move to a concept that is not well defined, I would say poorly, and maybe even not defined at all, called essential use. And that just becomes a political decision instead of a scientific one. I prefer risk
Yes.
assessment. This is going to be, well, let me say it with a Chinese proverb, that you live in interesting times. I think we're going to get interesting times once ethanol has been classified by the BPR regulatory authorities. And I don't think they can get away from not classifying it as a Repro 1B.
Oh, it's interesting to have that forecast, a realistic forecast of the direction that we're heading in. And yeah, the essential use concept is interesting because, as you say, it's very much. I mean, there's obviously some degree of science to it, especially social science, but a lot of it would be value driven and therefore political. And I see that as well. Again, linking back to persistence, I see that as a lot of value elements go into that rather than the objective science. At least when we had everybody on board with risk assessment, we could work a little bit more in the natural science domain and measure things objectively and make decisions that way. But, well,
Yes.
do you have any more reflections about your time at ECHA? I guess one thing that occurs to me is that both from your time in the member state committee and then also with your work on biocides as well, there was a heavy involvement of member state competent authorities in the work that you did.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes.
And I think that's essential because it's not possible for having everybody working within ECHA and have ECHA such a broad expertise that it can cover everything. The link with the member states is for me critical. Many good scientists there, and they give some counterbalance to some of the thoughts if you live in your bubble in your ECHA bubble. So I think that personally, I find it still we've lost a lot of very good scientists from the UK when you had your Brexit. In my point of view, the UK gave very much a sound of reason in all of the discussions, the scientists from them. We've had in the Member States Committee sometimes somewhat more politically or policy tense debates, and they were always focusing back on the science. To the point then, if the member states decided not to fully follow the science, then they were still working and helping to develop the decisions such that they were scientifically as rigorous as possible. with them moving away out of the EU. We're not having that type of perspective anymore. I cannot say for the past 4 years, I have not been in the Member States Committee, so I don't know how it has further developed. But some old farts, some dinosaurs has left, like Hendrik Thiele was also one of those that could bring a lot of science to the table, that also had the balls to say at the meeting of the Member States Committee, yeah, I came here with the mandate to vote against, but I've listened to the arguments and I hear that we haven't looked at everything from all the scientific angles, and having heard the discussion, I will now vote in favor. So he had the balls then to go back home and have to defend this move,
Mm.
not following his mandate. I don't know if there are still those type of characters in the Member States Committee. I've lost the touch there in the past 4 years. But I hope there are people that are willing to say, hey, but this is not correct. We're like lemmings going in one direction. What is the scientific evidence?
Yes, and I think you highlight how important it is to have good people across the board working in these different areas that do have the competence and also the agency to speak up on things. I don't think we're any better over here in the UK for having done our Brexit, as you say. It certainly seems like our regulatory environment is um, probably on life support, I would say, because we still don't seem to know what we want to do. And as a result, I think we're just kind of trundling along. But yeah, I've heard that many times from people to say that it was very regrettable that the UK left a lot of these discussions.
And Chris, you mentioned now a key word, regrettable. And we're talking
Mm.
about regrettable substitution is
Mm.
a concept, but we also, I think, moving into regrettable restriction. Ethanol could be an example, but I think the whole PFAS discussion could lead to regrettable restrictions. We're talking about a group of substances, tens of thousands, and we're bringing them all together in one pot because of persistence. And then we're using maybe some toxicity information from a few of the substances in that pot to develop health thresholds. I think that for me is moving in the wrong direction. When we were talking about QSARs and when we're talking about read across and applying that for filling information gaps, we're very concerned about extrapolation. You should not extrapolate beyond the database that you have. Well, I see a lot of extrapolation going on in the context basically of the PFAS toxicity assessment. And it's really the contrast that I see there with the early days that I was involved in environmental sciences with the dioxins and the PCBs. There we developed toxicity equivalent factors. We recognized that there was one dioxin highly toxic and others were less toxic. So we took that into account in an overall toxicity assessment. It's not happening anymore. It's just we're using one number for all of them. So I think we will restrict the use of some perfluorinated substances that we will regret, that may not be in itself toxic, that we may find do have a possibility for some further degradation, that may not necessarily have TFA as a final degradation product. And we're doing that because we're not using risk assessment. And yeah, I have moved myself from being an optimist to maybe more of a realistic pessimist. I think this is where I see the evolution going, moving away from risk assessments. In my early days, I had hoped that we would move from the binary risk assessment, the PEC over PNEC, more than one or less than one was giving you the answer, into more probabilistic risk assessment, where we would be able to deal with the uncertainties in the parameters, maybe in the boxes that we had or in the species that we had, and give more of a probabilistic feedback to the risk managers and say, yeah, we're close to one. We have a certain amount of chance that we will be over one. We're not using that type of uncertainty anymore. We're not moving into probabilistic risk assessment, I think. So I'm pessimistic there. I had hoped for that, but I don't think that in this society we're not willing to deal with uncertainty. It's black and white. We're polarized there. As scientists, we're not good in communicating this uncertainty.
Yes, I get the sense that this is in part driven by an overall lack of degradation in trust for authority or trust for expertise, and in the ability for technocratic solutions to address societal problems. And we're just kind of one example of where that is now impacting how we're making decisions as a society. And society will suffer as a result of that. But do you see any? Do you have any thoughts on how we can improve that situation? What we can potentially change to reverse this?
Well, I think we have a lot of pseudo facts going around. I think it starts with educating young people about trying to understand the reliability of information that they gather. I think that's critical, as education is the key. For me, I'm already far beyond, well, I'm still educatable, but it doesn't have a big impact anymore. It really is for the younger generation how to deal with uncertainty, how to assess if information is accurate, how to deal with AI. With the chat GPTs, you can get all kinds of nice answers, but when you then put your human eye over it, you will have to make a lot of adjustments. I do believe that AI could have some impact in the sense of doing meta-analysis for the information that has been published. Nowadays, Chris, it's easy to publish because publishing is a business. You have journals that just want to make money, so they publish anything. And then you accumulate a lot of garbage, which will be distributed to the public. They get scared by that. A very nice example, I think, was a recent meta-analysis by EFSA, and I don't know if they used AI to help perform the meta-analysis, but they looked at the body of evidence on micro and nanoplastics in food, where they had 1,700 publications. In the end, they looked at a little bit less, but they analyzed all of that information to see, okay, well, what is the evidence of micro and nanoplastics in food? They came to the conclusion, yes, it's probably there, but they also came to the conclusion that a lot of the information published had all kinds of flaws associated with that. And basically, on that basis, they come to a conclusion that it's not necessary at this moment to raise a red flag about micro and nanoplastics, but raise a red flag about the underpinning garbage. And the nice thing is you can give that type of message, but on the other hand, also for the scientist, it gives you a very clear possibility for asking critical questions for future research. If you know where are the flaws, you know where to focus on further developing the science. And well, one of the flaws was analytical with nano microplastics. Identification is definitely a key issue. Contamination is definitely a key issue you need to be able to address. But going back to how to improve things, this is where AI might help with the overload of information to start sifting through what is key information, what is garbage. I would love to maybe do some similar type of work as EFSA did if I had the skills to work with AI on all of the micro and nanoplastics found in the environment and find out now which of that is now really good science that we can base conclusions and risk management on, and which of that information is something that we need to discard. And what communication can we give to the general public that mainly is looking at the TikToks messages. And I'm not good at that, but I think we need to engage some social scientists to bring some of those messages to those type of platforms. So that's where we can improve. And where we should improve, but I don't have a solution, Chris, is the issue of the publish and perish item for academics. It becomes publication is the key currency for a
Yes.
scientist. And if you can create a buzz on your topic, then you will be able to publish a lot, maybe good or maybe not so good. And the more you publish, the more possibilities you also have for generating project money. So in the old days, sorry, 13 years more old, we had a lot of countries giving academics grants for research that was just fundamental, that didn't have an immediate impact, or where there was not a clear,
Yes.
let's say, message to say we might be able to use this for this and this and that. Well, that wasn't irrelevant. That type of money is sort of have gone. In your project proposals, you already need to start talking about applications. So it becomes much more focused. And if there is an issue, or if there is a buzz of an issue, yeah, your research might get more funding.
Mm.
So science has become business.
Yeah.
And that's where I'm pessimistic. How do we break through that? How can we make science less of a business? That's a challenge and maybe discussion also within CTEC.
Yes, I think that's very true. I mean, I think you'd have to be practicing quite a lot of willful blindness to deny how corrupting that those forces could be on the academic, on the scientific enterprise. And yeah, I see it as well in every corner of modern life that we're all on treadmills, we're all blinkered towards our short-term goals, and yeah, we're constantly being tempted um, to not do the responsible thing or to take the shortcut with things, and also we less and less afford the time to have dialogue amongst our peers. And I think things are getting slightly better, perhaps, that people are more willing to talk to one another, and that we don't have to always be right. I think people hopefully are getting more comfortable with not necessarily being the authority that everybody then looks to, and providing that space for more constructive discourse. But I think we do have a long way to go, and we also have many different opinions. And the people, I suppose, who are pushing for this universal ban on PFAS think that they are just as correct as well. And I think that problem also comes from a position of values and worldviews again, and less so from science. One of my hopes is that we can start to tease these things more out into the open, because they colour a lot of the conversations that we have. And I'd also say that because risk assessment does seem to be a bit of a dying art, and there's a lot of people kind of lamenting that situation, and I hope that more people can come out into the open to kind of champion that, also talk about why it is so valuable, why it's what we've relied on for the last 30, 40, 50 years to guide our development, and what the cost really would be or could be to doing something in a different way.
Yeah, and Chris, a value-free scientist doesn't exist. I think indeed some of the discussions are driven by values, and we need to be willing to be open about what values we are bringing to the table. But yeah, the dying art of risk assessment, yes, if I would have to give an advice to young scientists, is exposure, risk assessment, science to go into? I'm not sure. Maybe I've always worked on the interface between different disciplines. I would advise to look into polymer chemistry. With the REACH revision coming up and with polymers being under scrutiny, both in the sense of being registered under REACH with all the science developments that are required there, our traditional degradation tests, how well are they suited for polymers, what type of parameters to use for assessing the polymer behavior in the environment. How do polymers actually get into the animals because they're so big and there is membranes that could be barrier for uptake? Understanding polymer chemistry is essential in all of that. So even if you're a biologist, know your polymer chemistry. This is one of the fields that I still feel I want to further learn about. For me, I'm not going into PFAS. For me, that's, that in DuPont has been much engaged in that debate. I was also involved in the first PERFORCE project, which is perfluorinated substances research project funded by the EU. From a DuPont perspective, we were a partner in that project. So I have a bit of a history, but I don't want to persist in that. So I want to go more into polymer chemistry into the future, discussions about microplastics, what type of polymers can form microplastics, how do they behave. Hard plastics, if they are in the environment, are not the same as the ones that are produced. How does biology, but also environmental factors influence the particles in the environment? What is the actual risk that we have? I can remember 10, 15 years ago, a CTEC meeting where there was this science slam and people were making fun of microplastics research in the context of there is no toxicity. Well, that has evolved into, I think, again, a lot of scare maybe in society, but is it founded? And I think by understanding polymer chemistry, you're able to much better address some of the questions in that field. So
Yes.
if you're a young scientist, go on that interface, start to learn polymer chemistry combined with biology, which is still my first love, and then environmental engineering with models and fate and behavior. So become a polyglot.
Yes. Yeah, I definitely think that's really good advice. We are going to have a multidisciplinary view in many areas in the future. And I'm glad you raised that topic of polymers as well, because there is an almighty reckoning, I think, coming with polymers. And of course, we have huge diversity of polymers that we use in modern life for all kinds of different applications, and they provide a huge amount of benefits. But it seems clear to me that they're unlikely to fare well with the sort of default approach that's being applied in regulation and also with the current direction of travel. So I would definitely second what you say, that we need to get good minds focusing on tackling this problem.
Yeah. And maybe also bring in the socials or the communication specialists that are able to translate our nerdy talk into something that everybody understands.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Watze, it's been absolutely fantastic talking with you. We've spoken for an hour and a half, and it's absolutely flown by. I really appreciated speaking with you as somebody who really has a huge wealth of experience and insights to share. In preparation for this conversation, I also re-listened to the one that I had with Peter Fisk right at the beginning of my adventure
Great
with
episode.
podcasts, and he had some really great insights as well. And I think you and he are aligned in many areas in terms of your perspective. So I would encourage anyone listening, if you haven't listened to that episode, then please give that a listen as well. But just to wrap it up, so I normally ask my guests a couple of questions. I think you've already answered the second one there, which is about advice for somebody new in their career. But also, is there one big goal that you're sort of working towards in the months ahead?
Sorry, Chris, but I have listened too much to your podcast, so that's why I already answered the second question. But what am
Yeah.
I working towards? It's very personal. but it's fine. It's something we're working towards. My wife and I are living in a big apartment. Her daughter has a small apartment and no income. So we're working towards starting to live together. She's 30 plus and she has a boyfriend and the dog that was very silent. So happily to hear that. And that also is a very nice experience to live together with some youngsters. They have a totally different perspective on the world. Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how it works out. But I think, and that may be also an advice to youngsters, it's about trying to understand the other person, listen to the other person. What are your needs? What are my needs? Keep the communication open and don't assume that you're right and be willing to switch your views. So that's for me what I'm working towards currently, next to my Swedish lessons to become a Finnish citizen, my intercultural communication course that I'm following, my international humanitarian law career that I'm having with the Red Cross. So, what I'm working towards is still keeping enough time to do all the things I love to do.
Oh, that's fantastic, and I'm really glad you shared that personal experience and phase that you and your family are going through. I think that it's nice that you did that because so often we're always kind of driving at professional goals or things like that. A utilitarian kind of endeavor, and this is more just about learning to cohabit with people as a new experience and perhaps learning a bit about what it is to be a human. So yeah, really appreciate you sharing that, and also that's really great advice. Just once again, thanks very much for this. This has been fantastic, and thanks to everybody who's been listening. Your time's really precious, and so I'm really grateful that you've spent it with us. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please tell your friends and colleagues about it, and I look forward to speaking to you next time. Thank you, Watze.
Thank you, Chris, and see you soon at the CEDIC meeting, for instance.
Yeah, I hope so. Thank you.
Bye.